Hello and welcome to the Anthropodcast episode number 583. I'm your host, Justin Wallace, and today we are being joined by a very special guest coming in all the way from Dr. Foltz's anthropology class at Elmira College in southern New York. Welcome to the show, Ryan. Ryan happens to have done some research on China's two-child policy, which I happen to be interested in, so I decided that it would be a good idea to call him in to help me understand all this a bit better. Okay, so before we get into the children policies of China in the past century or so, we need to talk about the history of China. So, for 2,000 years until the early 20th century, China was ruled by an emperor. It was an empire. In the early 10s, it was overthrown and it created the beginning of modern China, which was the Republic of China. Now, in between the Republic of China and the communist Chinese state, you had this kind of intermittent civil war in the 20s, quasi-revolution kind of thing. It wasn't as clean as the Russian Revolution, which only took a couple years. This thing lasted nearly 2 decades, so it went on through World War II. Basically, it was skirmishes between different factions, mostly the Chinese Communist Party and the Nationalists, which eventually resulted in the Nationalists fleeing to what is now modern-day Taiwan. And if you know your current, geopolitical relations, both of them still claim to be the real China. So the Chinese authoritarian government started under the Chinese Communist Party. You could call anything under an empire an authoritarian government, but as we've seen in the 20th century, these communist countries, communist states can be really authoritarian. So that kind of set the stage to allow these party members to create their own decisions on reproductive rights, drug use, free speech, pretty much any type of thing you can think of. The authoritarian dictator could say something about it. He could decide if the punishment was a slap on the wrist or you and your family get sent to a death camp. So, Ryan, what do you think about these authoritarian governments? I think, obviously, as both of us come from America, we're not too fond of them, but do you think there's something there? I mean, we saw both the Russian communist state and the Chinese communist state somewhat fail, but both of them are somewhat prosperous today.
So, I've actually given this quite a bit of thought, and I don't have an exact answer for you, but I got something for you to think about. So, like you mentioned, several thousand years old, oldest modern day society that still exists. It's crazy that they've been going on for as long as they have. One might argue that if the USA had advanced, or if we were farther along in our country's timeline, as you know, we're only a couple hundred years old, relatively pretty young, maybe this would be the future for America. Maybe they know something about governing that we don't. I mean, obviously, freedom is great. We all enjoy it, but maybe their idea of, a unified country is one that will last longer. There's
Mm.
really only one way to tell, and that's to see how our country turns out, I guess.
I think that's a very good point because a lot of us forget that, America is so young, but also the fact that it's an experiment. And, experiments can either fail or succeed. The point of the experiment is not to fail or succeed, it's to prove something. And if you're wrong, it's not a big deal. The point is that you found out if you're right or wrong. So we still kind of have yet to see. And, if you want to be pessimistic about it, things aren't going too well for the country right now. So, I hate to say it, but maybe they had figured something out. So we're going to see what can happen under these regimes and what can make people so biased against the idea of a communist government. But we're also going to see later on, I think, how they can reverse these decisions and how it might work out for them later in the 21st century. We just don't know yet. So, our first question, Ryan, is what is a childbearing policy and why would one be implemented into a nation?
So, China's had this type of policy in place ever since 1978. This came by Deng Xiaoping, who rose to power in 76 following the death of Mao Zedong. And at the time, they'd been facing several decades of exponential growth, which their leading experts had, decided was going to be a problem at some point. And with the new regime change, it's a pretty good time to get the ball rolling on things.
Mm.
So the policy that they put in place was one that actually prevented families, not all of them, we'll get into the specifics a little bit later, but it prevented a good portion of Chinese citizens from not having more than one kid.
Okay. And so I think it's safe to say that this was a result of Deng Xiaoping trying to make a big statement play after the death of the Communist Party's, name brand chairman.
Yeah, I mean, you're a new guy in office, you got to make a name for yourself. It makes sense. You try to tackle one of the country's biggest issues right off the bat. How
Right. Okay.
successful that would go on to be is yet to be
Yeah.
seen,
Tell us.
but
Tell us how that played out for China. How did that all work out for them?
Well, it Honestly, it's almost impossible to say. It really is a matter of personal opinion once you've done the research. There are an incredible number of factors that have contributed to their waning population, but that's
Mhm,
not even to account for the general decline in the population of all Southeastern Asian countries that was going on during the mid 20th century.
mhm,
It's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly what the problem is, but to condense a pretty long answer down to something a little bit more manageable, basically what they did was they messed up the demographics of their population, not so much the overall amount, but they messed up the way that the society was structured. So basically, the average citizen wasn't so much a working age man, somebody contributing to things, somebody who's ultimately benefiting the country. It was
mhm,
rather an old person who was collecting Social Security, basically leeching off the government,
mhm.
which, everybody gets to that point, but when that's the majority of your country, it's not exactly productive. So it's more of like a slow burn kind of thing. You don't really see the lasting effects of it until decades after the law would have been implemented.
Right. Well, it's easy to make fun of the policy in the West, but looking at China's growth over the past half a century or so, it really does speak for itself, and it hasn't hampered the nation entirely, apparently.
Go.
So in your anthropology class, I understand that most of what you talk about regards sustainability. So, in what way does the childbearing policies of China relate to sustainability?
So the things we go over in the class typically focus on sustainability from a more, I guess, use of natural resources perspective.
Mhm,
We talk about a lot of things like deforestation, fracking, things like that that cause economic disaster in places. But I think one way that sustainability isn't as commonly thought about would be from population. If you
mhm,
don't have enough resources to accommodate your population, you're going to have a lot of people dying, and you can't really
mhm,
have that. So, from a sustainability standpoint, you need to figure out some way to, efficiently maximize your resources with your population so that ultimately you don't have to deal with those kind of issues.
mhm. Right. I think we can see that same problem trying to be tackled by the Soviet Union in the later 20th century, or maybe right around the middle. So it's interesting to see how both these superpowers, or soon to be superpowers, handled that issue. All right, so hearing about the history of the policy and how it has changed recently, would you assume that the three child policy will be more effective or less effective or completely different thing than its predecessors? Because a lot of the times with these former or quasi authoritarian regimes, you can see that they try and fix their mistakes with another hardcore kind of implemented policy, and it can end up taking two steps back instead of one. So, are you optimistic about this change, or do you think it's a different thing entirely?
So, it's kind of an interesting question. I think you have to really look at the goals of what each individual policy is trying to accomplish. I would say that the one-child policy is pretty straightforward and not difficult to understand. The population was growing, they wanted to stop that. Two and three were actually implemented under a different regime, Xi Jinping this time, and the purpose was more so to correct the mistakes that were made with the one-child policy, where their demographic population was so heavily skewed towards the top end. It was basically meant to start that exponential growth again, but in the right areas of society. I think another thing that changed in there that is going to be very beneficial overall for their population and quality of living is the deletion of Articles 41 and 42 that existed in the original one-child policy. Those are the laws that would hit your social credit score, would make you unable to get a job, you wouldn't be able to get into schools. If you broke that law, if you had more than the allotted amount of children that you were allowed to have per your family, you were basically done for in society. There really wasn't much that could be done to salvage your reputation at that point. So I think that when you remove that, I think overall just the quality of life in general increases to a point where even though you're still having laws placed around reproductive rights, which is kind of messed up to begin with, it's at least a pretty good starting point. And honestly, three kids per family is about as many as most families would want to have anyway. So I think it's a pretty good direction that they're headed in.
Right, and I think this is emblematic of that trend with both Russia or the former Soviet Union and China, where they kind of take these these notes from freer societies like the United States, where they still have these things that they want their population to do, but they're not enforcing them as strictly because maybe if you look at it pessimistically, you could say that they're trying to avoid responsibility if anything goes badly this time. Optimistically, you could say that things as a whole are moving forward. But overall, it's a very interesting policy. So it's been very good hearing from you, Ryan. I'd like to wish you good luck on your flight back to Elmira.
Thank you very much, Jay. Well,
Mhm. All right, with that, Ryan has left the building. So we're going to take a look at our next segment, which, let's see, our fan mail here says it comes from a man named Alex Jones in Austin, Texas, host of a little show called InfoWars. He'd like to make a note about the changes in the demographics and genders of frogs, or I guess sex of frogs in the water of Flint, Michigan.